The ballroom was a cage of shimmering silk and suffocating perfume. Genevieve felt its gilded bars pressing in on her, the light from the chandeliers glinting off them like polished steel. She stood near a potted palm, a fixture as unremarkable as the wilting fronds beside her. This was her third season, and the bloom of her debut had long since faded, leaving behind the quiet, thorny stem of spinsterhood. Her worth, she knew, was a currency that had devalued with each passing year. A chill, unrelated to the draught from the terrace doors, traced a path down her spine. Her father's words from that morning echoed in her mind, a death knell for the sliver of hope she had foolishly harboured. Lord Ashworth has made a most generous offer, Genevieve. It will see our family's debts cleared. He had not met her eyes, his gaze fixed on some distant point over her shoulder, as if the shame of selling his daughter was a sight he could not bear. Lord Ashworth. The name itself was a greasy stain on her thoughts. He was a man whose wealth was as vast as his cruelty was renowned. His eyes, small and porcine, had roamed over her during their one excruciatingly formal introduction, assessing her not as a woman, but as a broodmare, a decorative piece of property to add to his collection. The thought of his touch made her skin crawl, 1,000 tiny insects marching over her flesh. Her fingers tightened around the delicate stem of her untouched champagne flute. Resignation was a bitter drink, one she had been sipping for months. But tonight, the full, choking draught was being forced down her throat. She watched the other young ladies, bright and laughing, their futures still glittering with possibility. Hers felt like a path leading to a locked room, the key already turned, the air inside growing stale. Then, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. A hush fell over the chattering crowd, a wave of silence that began at the grand entrance and rippled outwards. It was as if a predator had entered the field, and all the smaller creatures had frozen in collective instinct. Genevieve craned her neck slightly, her curiosity momentarily eclipsing her despair. Through the parted sea of guests, he walked. The Duke of Alistair. He was a man carved from shadow and granite, his presence so immense it seemed to absorb the light around him. Whispers followed him like a cloak, tales of a ruthless negotiator, a man with a heart of ice, a recluse who tolerated society only when absolutely necessary. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his jaw sharp, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic indifference. He moved with a purpose that made everyone else's leisurely milling seem frivolous. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. It was a collision, unexpected and sharp. His gaze was not warm or inviting. It was intensely analytical, as if he had stripped away the facade of the ballroom and seen the desperate creature hiding behind the potted palm. Genevieve's breath caught in her throat. She looked away first, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was terrifying. He was the most powerful man in the room, and she was less than nothing. Later, Lord Ashworth found her. His approach was heralded by the cloying scent of his pomade. "My dear Lady Genevieve," he began, his voice a wet, unpleasant sound. "I trust you are contemplating our shared future with the enthusiasm it deserves." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his breath sour with wine. "Your father and I have come to a most satisfactory arrangement. You will be a duchess one day, of a sort. My duchess." He chuckled, a low, guttural noise that vibrated with ownership. "You will learn to be accommodating." "I expect it." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her resignation. This was it. This was the reality. Not a distant abstract dread, but a leering face, a possessive hand that dared to brush her arm. She flinched away, murmuring a polite excuse as she turned and fled. She did not run, but her every step was a flight, her silk slippers whispering against the marble floors. She needed air. She needed to escape the cage. She pushed through the doors to the cool night of the terrace, her lungs burning. The manicured garden stretched out below, bathed in moonlight, a perfect, orderly world that mocked the chaos raging within her. She could not do it. She could not marry that man. She would rather throw herself from the balcony than submit to a life in his suffocating grasp. Her frantic gaze swept the circular drive below. Carriages waited in a neat line, their lanterns casting warm, golden pools of light. And there, at the front of the line, was a carriage that stood apart from the others. It was stark black, adorned only with a silver crest on the door. A wolf's head, lean and formidable. The Duke of Alistair's carriage. An idea, wild and utterly insane, sparked in the darkness of her mind. It was a mad woman's gambit, a leap into an abyss. But the abyss was unknown, and the future with Lord Ashworth was a known and certain hell. Her choice was not between good and bad, but between one monster and the possibility of another. She did not hesitate. The thought had barely formed before her feet were moving, carrying her down a servant's staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She slipped out a side door, her ball gown a pale shimmer in the shadows. The coachman was speaking to another, his back turned. The door to the Duke's carriage was, by some miracle, slightly ajar. With a final, terrified glance over her shoulder, Genevieve pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip inside. She fell onto the plush velvet squabs, pulling the door silently shut behind her. She huddled on the floor, tucking her voluminous skirts around her, trying to make herself as small as possible. The carriage smelled of old leather and something else, a clean, masculine scent of bergamot and winter air. She held her breath, listening to the muffled sounds from outside, and waited. It was the act of a desperate fool. It was the only act she had left. It felt like an eternity passed in the silent, fragrant darkness. Her panic slowly subsided, replaced by a cold, trembling dread. What had she done? What would he do when he found her? The stories about the Duke were not children's tales. Men had been financially ruined by his displeasure, their reputations shattered with a single, cutting word. He would not be merciful. The carriage door opened abruptly, flooding the interior with a brief wash of lantern light, before it was plunged back into shadow as he entered. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut, her body rigid with fear. She heard him settle onto the seat, the leather groaning under his weight. The door clicked shut with a sound of finality. A moment of absolute silence. She could feel his presence, a weight in the small space that was more than just physical. Then, the carriage lurched forward, the wheels crunching on the gravel drive. He had not seen her. A tiny, hysterical bubble of relief rose in her chest, but it was short-lived. "You may come out now," a low, calm voice said into the darkness. It was not a question. It was a command, spoken with such quiet authority that it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Genevieve remained frozen on the floor, unable to move or speak. Her throat was tight with unshed tears. He did not raise his voice. "I dislike repeating myself. On the seat, now." Slowly, stiffly, she uncurled herself. Her limbs felt like lead as she pushed herself up from the floor and onto the seat opposite him. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on her own trembling hands, unable to look at the formidable shadow across from her. The carriage rolled on, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves, the only sound for several long, agonizing minutes. "You have exactly until we reach my townhouse to explain why you are in my carriage," he said at last, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion. "If your explanation is unsatisfactory, my driver will deposit you at the nearest magistrate's office." The words tumbled out of her, a frantic, whispered torrent of despair. She told him about her family's ruin, about her father's decree, about Lord Ashworth. She did not plead or beg for pity. She stated the facts of her entrapment, her voice cracking with the strain of holding back her tears. "I could not marry him," she finished, her voice barely audible. "I could not. Hiding in your carriage it was the only door I saw." Another long silence stretched between them. She finally dared to lift her gaze. In the flickering gloom cast by the passing street lamps, she could see the hard lines of his face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. He was simply watching her, his dark eyes intense and unnervingly perceptive. "You chose my carriage specifically," he stated. She nodded, swallowing hard. "You are the Duke of Alistair. Lord Ashworth, he would not dare cross you. No one would." A strange, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. He leaned forward slightly, the movement precise and controlled. "So you sought not just an escape, but a shield." "I sought a fortress," she whispered, the word tasting of desperation on her tongue. The carriage slowed, turning onto a quieter, grander street lined with imposing townhouses. They were nearing his home. Her time was running out. She braced herself for his cold dismissal, for the command to his driver that would seal her fate. Instead, he said something so utterly unexpected that she was certain she had misheard him. "I will offer you a different arrangement, Lady Genevieve." She stared at him, her mind blank with shock. "I require a duchess," he continued, his tone as matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the weather. "My station demands it, and the endless parade of hopeful mothers and their simpering daughters has become tiresome. You require protection and a means to secure your family's future. A marriage between us would solve both our problems." Genevieve could not speak. The world had tilted on its axis. The feared, unapproachable Duke of Alistair was proposing a marriage of convenience to a woman he had just found hiding on the floor of his carriage. "The terms would be simple," he went on, his gaze unwavering. "You would be the Duchess of Alistair in name and title. You would manage my households, a task for which I have little patience. In return, I will settle your family's debts in their entirety and ensure that Lord Ashworth never troubles you or them again. Our lives would be our own. I would expect your discretion and your loyalty. Nothing more. Nothing more." The words hung in the air between them. No affection, no companionship. A business transaction, conducted in the dark of a carriage. It was a different kind of cage, vast and cold and lonely. But its bars would be forged of gold and power, and its keeper was this formidable, unreadable man, not the lecherous Lord Ashworth. The carriage stopped. They had arrived. "This is your door, Lady Genevieve," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "You may walk through it into my house as my future wife, or you may walk away. The choice is yours, but you must make it now." She looked from his impassive face to the carriage door. Outside lay the dark, unforgiving streets of London, and a future of ruin and despair. Inside was a proposition that was both terrifying and, in its own strange way, a lifeline. She was trading one prison for another, but this one offered safety. It offered her family's salvation. Her own voice sounded distant, a stranger's voice, when she finally answered, "I accept, Your Grace." The marriage was as swift and impersonal as the proposal. A special license, a quiet ceremony in the Duke's drawing room, with only his solicitor and her bewildered father as witnesses. Her father, his relief at the settlement of his debts warring with his confusion, had tried to question her, but Genevieve had offered no explanation. How could she explain an act of pure, animal desperation? Now, she was the Duchess of Alistair, a title that felt like an ill-fitting gown. She walked the cavernous, silent halls of Alistair House, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The staff were impeccably trained, moving like ghosts, their deference a constant reminder of her new station. Yet, she felt more like a ghost than any of them. The Duke, Alistair, as he had instructed her to call him in private, was a creature of habit and distance. They took their meals together in a dining room so vast that their quiet conversation felt swallowed by the space. He was polite, impeccably so. He inquired after her day, listened to her reports on the household management, and occasionally offered a dry, insightful comment on politics or literature. He was, she discovered, extraordinarily intelligent. His library was a treasure trove filled with rare books and first editions. He had given her free rein of it, and it became her sanctuary. But the man himself remained a locked room. He spent his days in his study, managing his vast estates and business interests, and his evenings often in that same study, or at his club. Their lives ran on parallel tracks, close but never touching. The "nothing more" clause of their agreement was strictly observed. They had separate bedchambers, connected by a shared sitting room she had never seen him use. A polite nod in the hallway, a formal good night at the dining table. These were the boundaries of their intimacy. It was a lonely existence, but it was a safe one. Lord Ashworth had vanished from society as if he had never existed, and a steady stream of funds had quietly restored her family's fortunes. She had upheld her end of the bargain. So had he. Yet she found herself watching him. She was an observer by nature, and the Duke was a fascinating, frustrating puzzle. She started to notice the cracks in his cold armor, tiny fissures that hinted at something more beneath the surface. One afternoon, while searching for a book in the library, she found one left on a small reading table. It was a slim volume of poetry by a little-known female poet she had mentioned in passing weeks ago, remarking that she had never been able to find a copy. There was no note, no indication that he had left it for her, but she knew. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she could not immediately name it. Another evening, at a dinner hosted by the Marquis of Fleet, she found herself seated next to Lady Tremaine, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her ambition. Lady Tremaine had her sights set on the Duke before their sudden marriage, and made no secret of her disdain for Genevieve. "Such a surprising match," Lady Tremaine had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "One wonders what a man of the Duke's stature saw in such a quiet little mouse, especially one left on the shelf for so long." The insult was meant to sting, and it did. Genevieve felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crumble. Before she could form a reply, Alistair's voice cut through the air from across the table, cool and precise. "Lady Tremaine," he said, not looking at her but at the Marquis, "I was just telling our host that I find society's obsession with loud, empty vessels to be profoundly tedious. I have always preferred substance, depth, qualities that are, sadly, in short supply." The table fell silent. Lady Tremaine's face paled, then flushed a mottled red. The subject was changed abruptly, but the message had been delivered. He had defended her, not with passion or anger, but with the cool, lethal precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He had not looked at Genevieve once during the exchange, but, as they rode home in the carriage, the comfortable silence between them felt different, charged with an unspoken significance. The most significant crack appeared one rain-swept Tuesday. She had been exploring the far wing of the house and found a small, locked door at the end of a dusty corridor. Her curiosity piqued. She asked the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, for the key. The older woman hesitated. "His Grace keeps that door locked himself, Your Grace. It is his private conservatory." Later that day, Genevieve found the courage to ask him about it. He looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable as always. She expected a polite refusal. Instead, he simply nodded, retrieved a small, ornate key from his desk drawer, and led her to the door. He unlocked it and pushed it open. Genevieve gasped. Beyond the door was not a dusty, forgotten room, but a breathtaking glass house, filled with the most extraordinary collection of orchids she had ever seen. Delicate, vibrant blooms of every shape and color imaginable cascaded from pots, climbed trellises, and hung in the humid air like living jewels. The scent was intoxicating. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He walked to a pale, star-shaped orchid, its petals almost translucent. "She loved them. I maintain it." Here, in this secret, living world, the formidable Duke of Alastair seemed different. The hard lines of his face softened. He spoke of the flowers with a quiet knowledge and a tenderness that was utterly at odds with his public persona. He showed her how to miss the delicate petals, his large, capable hands surprisingly gentle. For the first time, she saw not the Duke, but the man. A man who tended to fragile, beautiful things in secret. A man who remembered a passing comment about a book of poetry. A man who would defend her honor with cutting words. The puzzle of him was growing more complex and more compelling with each passing day. She had entered this arrangement for safety, but she was beginning to find something far more dangerous. Curiosity. And a flicker of something that felt perilously close to hope. The fragile peace of their arrangement was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It bore her mother's frantic, spidery script. Genevieve read it in the morning room, the pale sunlight doing little to warm the sudden chill that had settled deep in her bones. "My dearest Genevieve," it began, "I pray this letter finds you well, though I must confess my heart is full of worry. Dreadful rumors have begun to circulate. Lord Ashworth, that vile man, has been spreading the most malicious gossip. He implies that your virtue was compromised, that the Duke was forced into this marriage to avoid a scandal of your own making. He whispers of a clandestine meeting, of a desperate flight into the night." Genevieve's blood ran cold. He was twisting the truth into a weapon, painting her as a ruined, scheming woman, and the Duke as her reluctant savior. The letter continued, detailing how her father had been snubbed at his club, how whispers followed her younger sister, Charlotte, at every social gathering. The fortress Alistair had built around her was sound, but the poison was seeping through the walls, sickening her family. That evening, she waited for him in the library, the letter clutched in her hand. When he entered, he took one look at her pale face and closed the door behind him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She held out the letter. "Lord Ashworth, he is trying to ruin my family." He took the letter and read it, his expression hardening into granite. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. When he finished, He folded the paper with meticulous precision and placed it on the mantelpiece. "This will be dealt with," he said. It was not a promise of comfort. It was a statement of fact, cold and final. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "A duel? It will only fuel the scandal." He turned to face her, his dark eyes holding hers. "There are ways to silence a man like Ashworth that do not involve pistols at dawn. He has business interests. Many of them are fragile. He will learn that the consequences of angering me are far more severe than a simple flesh wound." True to his word, the rumors stopped. They did not just fade away. They ceased abruptly, as if a tap had been turned off. Lord Ashworth disappeared from the social scene entirely, and whispers soon circulated of his sudden, catastrophic financial ruin and his hasty departure to the continent. Alistair never spoke of it again. He simply eliminated the threat, a quiet, ruthless act of protection that left Genevieve breathless. But the incident had stirred the hornet's nest. The very public nature of Ashworth's downfall, coupled with the Duke's clear involvement, only intensified society's scrutiny of their marriage. At their next major social event, a ball at the home of the Duchess of Richmond, Genevieve felt the weight of 100 curious stares. She was standing near the orchestra, trying to fade into the background, when Lady Tremaine approached, a malicious glitter in her eyes. She was not alone. She was flanked by two of her equally venomous friends. "Your Grace," Lady Tremaine purred, her curtsy a mockery. "How clever you were, to ensnare the Duke so thoroughly. One must admire your resourcefulness." Her eyes swept over Genevieve's gown. "Though I suppose when one is desperate, any port in a storm will do." The insult was public, designed for maximum humiliation. The guests nearby fell silent, their ears straining to catch the drama. Genevieve felt her face flame, her carefully constructed composure dissolving under the heat of their collective gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. And then, he was there. Alistair seemed to materialize from the crowd, his presence instantly commanding the space around them. He did not look at Lady Tremaine. Instead, he offered Genevieve his arm. "My dear," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily to those listening. "I find the company in this corner of the room to be lacking. Shall we?" He turned his gaze, cold and dismissive, upon Lady Tremaine for a single, fleeting moment. "Lady Tremaine, a word of advice. It is unwise to mistake a quiet nature for a weak one. My wife has more strength and integrity in her little finger than you and your simpering friends possess in your entire beings. And I would remind you that an insult to the Duchess of Alistair is an insult to me. Do you understand?" The woman blanched, her smug expression collapsing into one of shocked fear. She could only nod, speechless. Alistair led Genevieve away, his hand a firm, steady presence on her arm. He guided her toward the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. He pulled her into his arms, and they began to move, the rest of the room blurring into a swirl of color and light. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, leading her with an effortless confidence. For the first time, she was in his arms, the formal distance between them erased by the steps of the dance. She could feel the warmth of his hand on her back, the solid strength of his frame. She looked up at his face, but his expression was as guarded as ever. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. He looked down at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "I was merely protecting my investment," he said, his voice cool. But his eyes told a different story. For a fleeting second, she saw something in their depths, a flicker of heat, a raw vulnerability that was gone as quickly as it appeared. The words were meant to push her away, to re-establish the cool, business-like terms of their arrangement. But they had the opposite effect. The blatant contradiction between his protective actions and his cold words deepened the mystery of him. Why go to such lengths for an investment? Why defend her with such quiet ferocity, only to retreat behind a wall of indifference? That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, her mind replaying the events of the evening. The feel of his hand on her back, the brief, unguarded look in his eyes. He was a man of profound contradictions, and she was no longer content to live beside the puzzle. She needed to understand it. She needed to know why. She rose from her bed, pulling on a silk robe. The house was silent, wrapped in the deep stillness of the early morning hours. She padded barefoot across the cold floor, through the shared sitting room she had never dared to enter, and stood before the door to his bedchamber. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. She did not knock. Instead, she pushed the door open gently. It was unlocked. A single lamp burned on a desk in the corner, casting a low golden light. He was not in bed. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the moonlit glass, staring out at the sleeping city. He turned as she entered, his body tensing for a moment before he recognized her. "Genevieve?" His voice was rough with surprise, and something else she couldn't identify. She walked further into the room, her resolve hardening with each step. "I have to ask you something." He did not move from the window. "Ask." "Why?" The word was small, but it filled the cavernous room. "Why are you doing all of this? You settled my family's debts. You ruined Lord Ashworth. You defended me tonight. You said our marriage was a simple transaction, that you expected nothing more than loyalty and discretion. But this is more." He remained silent, his face in shadow. "You called me your investment," she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "But you don't treat me like one. You protect me as if I mattered to you. I don't understand. Why did you really agree to marry a desperate woman you found hiding in your carriage? The truth, Alistair. I deserve the truth." He turned from the window then, and the moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face. He looked weary, the iron mask of control he wore so constantly, showing signs of strain. He walked to the desk and braced his hands on it, his head bowed for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raw, stripped of its usual cool authority. "Because I have been in love with you for 5 years." The confession fell into the silent room like a stone into a frozen pond, the impact shattering the surface of everything she thought she knew. Genevieve could only stare at him, her heart stopping in her chest. It was impossible. It made no sense. "What?" she breathed. He finally looked at her, and the vulnerability she had glimpsed on the dance floor was now laid bare in his eyes. The Duke of Alastair was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a long-held secret. "I saw you for the first time at your debutante ball," he said, his voice hoarse. "You were standing by a fountain, talking about a book with such passion. You were luminous. Everyone else seemed to be playing a part, but you were real." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I was a fool. I was 27, already saddled with the dukedom, and a reputation I had done little to discourage. I am not a man for ballrooms and pleasantries, Genevieve. I am awkward. I am severe. I saw the way other men approached you, how easily they smiled and laughed. I knew I could never be one of them." He began to pace the room, the controlled movements of the Duke replaced with a restless energy she had never seen. So I watched you, from a distance, for years. I told myself it was enough. I convinced myself that you were destined for a brilliant match, for a life filled with the warmth and happiness that a man like me could never provide. I saw you as a light I was not worthy to touch. Genevieve stood frozen, her mind reeling. She tried to recall her debut, to picture the stern, silent Duke in the shadows of a ballroom, but the image wouldn't form. He had been so far above her, so utterly untouchable. The night of the ball, he continued, stopping to face her again. I heard your father speaking with Ashworth. I heard the terms of their vile bargain. And then I saw you, your face so pale, so full of despair. Something inside me broke. The thought of you in that man's hands was a torment I could not endure. I was on my way to find your father, to offer him any amount of money to call it off, to do something. He took a step closer to her, his eyes dark with the memory. And then I found you in my carriage, a terrified, brave, desperate woman who had chosen me as her fortress. It felt like a sign. It was the coward's way out, I know. Proposing a marriage of convenience was easier than confessing years of silent, hopeless affection. It was a selfish, desperate act to have you, to keep you safe, even if it meant you would live beside me as a stranger, never knowing the truth. His coldness, his distance, his formal politeness, it had all been a shield, a defense mechanism built by a man who believed himself unworthy of the woman he loved. His quiet gifts, his fierce protection, they were not the actions of a business partner, but the offerings of a secret admirer. My whole life has been a series of duties and expectations, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. My parents' marriage was a cold affair, a transaction much like the one I proposed to you. It is the only thing I ever knew. I don't know how to be the man you deserve, Genevieve. I only know how to be the Duke. So I protected my Duchess. It was the only way I knew how to love you. He stood before her, the most powerful man she had ever known, looking utterly exposed. He had confessed his deepest secret, his greatest vulnerability, and now he simply waited, braced for her judgment. Genevieve's shock slowly melted away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy that was so strong it made her knees weak. She didn't see a cold, calculating Duke who had deceived her. She saw a lonely, guarded man who had loved her silently for years. A man who had used his immense power not for gain, but to shield her from a fate he could not bear to imagine for her. She thought of all the times she had felt his eyes on her across a crowded room, misinterpreting his intense gaze as disapproval or judgment. She thought of the book of poetry, the orchids, the way he had dismantled her enemies without a second thought. It all clicked into place, forming a picture not of a convenient arrangement, but of a deep and patient devotion. And then she revealed a secret of her own. I noticed you too, she whispered, the admission startling even herself. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. Not at my debut, she clarified, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. I was too terrified of everyone then. But later, at parties, you were always in the corner, away from the crowds. Everyone said you were intimidating, fearsome, but I just saw a man who looked as out of place as I felt. I was too afraid to ever speak to you. You were a duke. I was nobody. A flicker of disbelief, followed by a dawning, fragile hope, illuminated his face. He took another step, closing the small distance that remained between them. He slowly lifted a hand, as if afraid she might bolt, and gently brushed a stray curl from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. Genevieve. He breathed her name, and it was a prayer. She didn't need to think. She didn't need to weigh her options. Her heart, which had been so carefully guarded for so long, made the decision for her. She had run from one cage and into what she thought was another. But she was wrong. This was not a cage. It was a sanctuary, built by a man who had loved her all along. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her cheek, leaning into his touch. "You are not just the Duke, Alistair," she said softly, looking directly into his eyes, seeing past all his defenses to the man within. "And I am not just your Duchess." The last of his control seemed to shatter. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not a fiery, passionate onslaught. It was tentative at first. A question. It was gentle, searching, full of years of unspoken longing and reverence. It spoke of rainy afternoons in a secret conservatory, of quiet acts of protection, of a love that had flourished in silence and shadows. Genevieve melted into him, her arms circling his neck, kissing him back with all the pent-up hope and nascent affection she had been too afraid to acknowledge. It was a kiss of acceptance, of understanding. It was the closing of a door on a life of loneliness, and the opening of another to a future she had never dared to imagine. In the quiet of the moonlit room, two strangers who had been married for months, finally, truly, met for the first time. 2 years later, the afternoon sun streamed through the glass panes of the conservatory, dappling the vibrant orchid blooms with warm light. The air was humid and sweet with the scent of flowers. Alistair House was no longer a silent, cavernous place. It was a home, filled with the sounds of life and the quiet hum of happiness. Genevieve sat on a small wrought-iron bench, a book lying open but forgotten in her lap. She watched her husband, who was carefully tending to a new, delicate orchid. The feared, formidable Duke of Alistair was on his knees, his brow furrowed in concentration as he gently repotted the fragile plant. The severe lines of his face were gone, softened by a contentment that seemed to radiate from him. He looked up and saw her watching, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a smile she had come to cherish, one reserved only for her, a private treasure that still made her heart flutter. "It will be a fine addition," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. He wiped his hands on a cloth and came to sit beside her, draping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of earth and bergamot. From the open door leading to the gardens, the sound of a child's gleeful shriek reached them, followed by the soft, laughing admonishment of a nursemaid. A moment later, a small boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's curious eyes toddled into the conservatory, his small hands grasping a bright red ball. "Papa!" the boy exclaimed, holding the ball up for inspection. Alistair's smile widened. He scooped their son into his arms, settling him on his lap. "Well done, James. A formidable catch." Genevieve watched them, her heart so full she felt it might burst. This life, this warmth, this love. It had all been born from a single, desperate act in the dark. She had thought she was running from a prison, a future locked away and decided for her. She had flung herself into the unknown, into the carriage of a man who was a legend, a shadow. She had expected a gilded cage, a life of cold, lonely safety. Instead, she had found freedom. She had found a patient, quiet love that had been waiting for her all along. She learned that a person's worth was not determined by society's timeline or a father's ledger. It was intrinsic, waiting to be seen by the right pair of eyes. She had sought a fortress to hide in, and in the heart of its stern, silent keeper, she had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. It was never too late, she mused, to truly begin to live.